Cemetery groundskeeper would later say he had never seen anything like it in 22 years on the job, a dog lying across a closed casket, refusing every attempt to move him, while 300 mourners stood frozen in the July heat, watching a funeral director's polished instructions fall apart in real time. Nobody there that day knew yet that the dog wasn't just grieving. He was guarding something, and it would take one broken-down veteran 3 more weeks to figure out exactly what. Jake Dunmore woke up that morning the way he woke up most mornings, which was to say badly, with his left leg aching from the cold front rolling through, and his right ear ringing faintly with a frequency that had never fully gone quiet since a spring afternoon outside Kandahar 11 years earlier. He lay still on the narrow mattress in his rented single-wide for a full minute before he trusted his balance enough to sit up, running a hand over his face, feeling the rough 2-day stubble and the particular hollowness behind his eyes that meant he'd slept maybe 3 hours, tops. The trailer sat on a quarter-acre outside Cummer Falls, a town small enough that the diner closed at 2, and the gas station doubled as the hardware store, and Jake had chosen it 3 years earlier for exactly that reason. Nobody in Cummer Falls asked questions. Nobody looked twice at a man who flinched when a truck backfired on Main Street, or who sat with his back to the wall in the one restaurant in town, watching the door out of habit rather than choice. He worked part-time doing small engine repair out of the trailer's detached shed, enough to cover the lot rent and keep the lights on, and the rest of his disability claim sat frozen in a review process that had, as of that morning, stretched past its 14th month. He made coffee in a dented percolator that had belonged to his grandfather, ate 2 eggs standing at the counter because he didn't own a kitchen table anymore. It had gone in the divorce, along with most everything else that had once made the word home feel like it meant something, and pulled on the only good shirt he owned, a charcoal button-down he kept pressed in a garment bag for exactly 2 occasions. Funerals and nothing else, because in the 11 years since he'd left the army, funerals were the only occasions that ever seemed to come up. This one was for Elias Whitfield. Jake had known Doc. Everybody who'd served with him called him Doc, even years after he'd left the medical corps behind, since a dust-choked morning in Kandahar province when Jake's Humvee had rolled over a pressure plate, and the world had gone sideways in a way that still visited him in dreams more nights than he liked to admit. Doc had been the one who'd gotten to him first, hands steady in a way Jake's never quite were again, packing the wound in his leg with a calm, running commentary that Jake would later understand had been less about medical necessity and more about keeping a scared, bleeding 24-year-old tethered to consciousness through sheer force of voice. Jake had lost partial hearing in his right ear that day. He had also lost Tank, the Belgian Malinois he'd handled for 2 deployments, killed instantly in the same blast, and there were still nights Jake woke reaching for a leash that wasn't there, his hand closing on empty air in the dark. Doc had gotten out 4 years after Jake did, and the 2 of them had stayed close in the loose, undemonstrative way that men who'd bled together tended to stay close, a phone call every few months, a visit every year or 2, no ceremony to it, just the quiet understanding that the line was always open. Doc had started a small nonprofit out of a storefront in Radford called Whitfield's Watch, helping veterans navigate disability claims and find transitional housing, running it mostly on grant money and sheer stubbornness. And the last time Jake had spoken to him, 6 weeks earlier, Doc's voice had carried something Jake hadn't liked: the sound of a tightness under the words, the specific flatness of a man carrying more weight than he was letting on. "You doing all right, Doc?" Jake had asked. "Working on it," Doc had said, and laughed in a way that hadn't quite reached the humor it was supposed to carry. "Some things are harder to fix than a gunshot wound, turns out." Jake had meant to call back. He always meant to call back. And then 3 weeks ago, a mutual friend from their old unit had called instead, his voice cracking on the second sentence, and told Jake that Elias Whitfield was dead at 41, found in his apartment above the Whitfield's Watch office, the county coroner citing cardiac arrest complicated by a mix of prescribed medication and alcohol that Jake, who had known Doc for 11 years and had never once seen him drink past a single beer, found almost impossible to square with the man he remembered. He drove the 2 hours to Radford with the radio off and his hands HT on the wheel, and he arrived at Cedar Hollow Memorial Cemetery 40 minutes before the service was scheduled to begin, only to find the parking lot already half full and a small commotion building near the cemetery's side gate. A dog was barking, not the frantic, undisciplined barking of a stray or a family pet overwhelmed by a crowd. A short, sharp, controlled bark, repeated at even intervals, the kind of sound Jake's trained ear recognized instantly as deliberate rather than distressed. He followed the sound before he'd fully decided to, some old muscle memory pulling him toward it the way it always had, back when a working dog's voice had meant something specific and urgent in his line of work. What he found at the gate was a heavyset man in an expensive dark suit, clearly some kind of funeral home or a state representative, standing with his arms crossed in front of a young cemetery groundskeeper who looked deeply uncomfortable, both of them facing off against a middle-aged woman, holding the leash of a large, scarred German shepherd whose ears were pinned back and whose whole body had gone rigid with a tension Jake recognized immediately. Because he had felt that exact tension in his own body more times than he could count. "I don't care what he meant to you," the man in the suit was saying, his voice pitched with the particular condescension of someone used to being obeyed. "The family has made a decision. No animals at the graveside service. It's a liability issue, it's a dignity issue, and frankly, sir, this isn't the venue for a debate." "He's not just an animal," the woman said, and Jake could hear the strain in her voice, the exhaustion of someone repeating an argument she'd clearly already lost once today. "This is Elia's dog. He raised him for 3 years. He wanted him here." Jake stepped closer, close enough now to get a good look at the dog, and felt something in his chest go very still. The shepherd's coat was marked with old scarring along one flank, patches where fur had never fully regrown, and his left eye carried a faint clouding that Jake recognized, with a jolt, as the specific kind of damage caused by close proximity to a blast, not blind, not entirely, but changed, the way Jake's own hearing had been changed on that road outside Kandahar. The dog's posture was textbook working dog discipline even now, even distressed, weight balanced, ears tracking every voice in the small crowd that had begun to gather. "What's his name?" Jake asked, before he'd fully decided to speak at all. The woman turned, startled, taking in Jake's charcoal shirt, his posture, the particular way he stood that marked him, to anyone who'd served as one of their own. "Nomad," she said. "Elias called him Nomad." The man in the suit turned his attention to Jake now, visibly irritated at the interruption. "And you are?" "Jake Dunmore. I served with Elias." He kept his voice level, kept his eyes on the man's face rather than his own clenched hands. "You want to explain to me why a decorated combat veteran's own dog isn't welcome at his funeral?" "Policy," the man said, already turning away, already dismissing the question as beneath a response. "Talk to the funeral home if you have a complaint." He walked off toward the gathering crowd, and Jake watched him go with the particular flat attention he'd once reserved for movement he didn't trust in a compound he hadn't cleared yet, filing away the man's face, his suit, the way he'd said policy like it was armor rather than an answer. If you're finding this story pulls at something in you, go ahead and hit that like button and consider subscribing. It genuinely helps stories like this one reach the people who need to hear them. And once you've finished, I'd love to know in the comments what you think Nomad already knew that everyone else standing at that gate didn't. Now, back to Cedar Hollow. The graveside service began 20 minutes later, and Jake stood near the back of the gathered crowd, close enough to see but far enough to keep his own composure intact, watching as an honor guard folded a flag with the same slow, practiced precision he remembered from too many services just like this one. The woman with the leash, he'd later learn her name, was Marion Castellan, a longtime volunteer at Whitfield's Watch who'd helped Doc care for Nomad since he'd first brought the dog home, had been made to wait at the cemetery's edge, out of sight of the main service, the dog straining gently against his leash the entire time, his eyes fixed on the small procession moving toward the open grave. It happened during the final moments of the service, just as the chaplain was closing his remarks, that Nomad broke. He didn't lunge or bolt in a panic. He moved with a purpose that made the hair on the back of Jake's neck rise, a controlled, deliberate run straight through the gathered mourners, slipping the leash from Marion's startled grip, cutting a direct line toward the casket that had not yet been lowered into the ground. He leapt in one clean motion onto the flag-draped surface and lay down across its full length, chin resting on his front paws, utterly, immovably still. The crowd gasped. Someone laughed briefly, in the particular startled way people laughed when they didn't yet understand they were witnessing something that would break their heart in about 4 seconds. The funeral director rushed forward, along with 2 cemetery staff, trying gently, then less gently, to coax the dog down, and Nomad simply pressed himself flatter against the casket, a low, warning rumble building in his chest that made every man in a uniform standing nearby go very quiet, very fast, because they all recognized exactly what that sound meant. Jake was moving before he'd consciously decided to, cutting through the crowd with the same economy of motion he'd once used clearing a hallway, and he reached the casket just as the funeral director, red-faced and flustered, was reaching for the dog's collar with a grip Jake didn't like the look of at all. "Don't," Jake said, and something in his voice, flat, certain, carrying 11 years of command presence he'd thought he'd left behind in a different country, made the man freeze. Jake crouched slowly beside the casket, keeping his movements deliberate and unhurried, the exact protocol he'd have used approaching any working dog he didn't know, hand held low and open, voice pitched soft. "Hey," he said quietly. "Hey, Nomad, I know, buddy." The dog's dark eyes flicked to him, wary, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Then slowly the growl faded, replaced by something that looked unmistakably like grief, a long, shuddering exhale, the dog's whole body sagging slightly against the casket as though some enormous weight had briefly been allowed to show itself. "He's not hurting anyone," Jake said, standing, turning to face the funeral director and the small crowd of stunned onlookers, several of whom, he noticed, already had their phones raised. "He's grieving, same as the rest of us. I'd think real hard before you decide dragging a war dog off his handler's coffin in front of 300 people is the hill you want to die on today." The service concluded, eventually, with Nomad allowed to remain exactly where he was until the final moment, and by the time Jake drove back to Cummer Falls that evening, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the 2-hour drive, a video of the moment, shaky, vertical, 31 seconds long, had already been uploaded by someone in the crowd, and by the following morning it had been viewed 400,000 times. Marion Castellan called him 2 days later. "I don't know how to say this except to just say it," she said, her voice tight with an exhaustion Jake recognized instantly, the kind that came from carrying something alone for too long. "Elias left instructions. A letter, actually, with his attorney, dated about 8 months back, the kind people write when they've got a bad feeling about something, I think, though I don't know what. It names you, guardian for Nomad if anything ever happened to him. I've been keeping the dog since the funeral, but I've got 3 kids and a job and no experience with a working dog like this one. And frankly, Mr. Dunmore, I think Elias knew exactly what he was doing when he wrote your name down instead of mine." Jake sat with the phone against his ear for a long moment, looking around the narrow, cluttered trailer that barely had room for himself, let alone a 100-pound shepherd with a war behind his eyes. "I don't know the first thing about taking care of a dog like that anymore," he said finally. "It's been 11 years. "He doesn't need someone who knows everything," Marion said quietly. "He needs someone who understands what he's carrying. I watched you at that grave, Mr. Dunmore. I don't think there's anybody better suited for that job in the whole state." Jake drove back to Radford 3 days later, telling himself the entire way that he was doing this out of obligation. Nothing more, a debt owed to a friend who'd once packed a wound in his leg with steady hands and a running commentary that had kept him alive. He told himself that right up until the moment Marion led Nomad out of her modest house on a short lead, and the dog stopped dead at the sight of him, ears coming forward, tail giving one slow, uncertain sweep, and something in Jake's chest cracked open in a way he hadn't expected and wasn't at all prepared for. "Hey, buddy," Jake said quietly, crouching down the way he had at the cemetery, and Nomad crossed the last few feet between them and pressed his scarred head hard against Jake's chest, staying there unmoving for a long, silent minute while Marion wiped her eyes and pretended not to notice. The drive back to Cummer Falls was quiet, Nomad riding in the back of Jake's aging pickup with his nose pressed against the window. Crack watching the world go by with the same wary alertness Jake recognized from his own reflection more mornings than he liked to admit. Jake talked to him the whole way, in the low, steady voice he hadn't used in over a decade, the voice that came back to him almost against his will, muscle memory older and deeper than the years that had tried to bury it. "I'm not gonna pretend I know what I'm doing here," he told the dog, somewhere around the second hour, glancing at the rearview mirror. "Fair warning, I haven't had a dog since." He stopped himself, throat tightening around a name he still couldn't say out loud without his hands going cold. "It's been a long time. You're gonna have to be patient with me, too." Nomad's ears flicked at the sound of his voice, and he shifted, just slightly, closer to the gap between the seats, and Jake decided right then that he was going to take that as a yes. The first week was harder than Jake had let himself expect. Nomad wouldn't eat from a bowl set on the floor, wouldn't settle in any room with the door closed, startled violently at the sound of the trailer's ancient furnace kicking on, and spent the first 3 nights pacing a tight, anxious circuit between the front door and Jake's bedroom, refusing to lie down for more than a few minutes at a time. Jake recognized every single one of those behaviors because he'd lived inside a version of them himself for years, and there was something almost unbearably intimate about watching his own worst nights reflected back at him through a dog's exhausted, wary eyes. "You and me both, pal," he muttered, the third night, sitting on the floor of the narrow hallway at 2 in the morning because Nomad wouldn't settle anywhere else, and something about a grown man sitting on cheap linoleum in his boxers at 2 a.m., keeping company with a traumatized war dog, would have struck Jake as pathetic in any other context. In this one, it just felt like the first honest thing he'd done in months. He called an old contact from his unit 2 days later, Master Sergeant Cal Ridgway, retired now himself, who'd spent the back half of his career running the kennel program at Lackland before hanging it up for a quiet life fixing motorcycles outside San Antonio. Jake read him the tag number stamped into a worn metal disc on Nomad's collar, along with the partial serial visible on the faded tattoo inside the dog's left ear, and waited while Cal ran it through channels that, 11 years out, he technically shouldn't have still had access to but clearly, somehow, did. Cal called back that evening, and Jake could hear something shift in his old friend's voice the moment he started talking. "You know who you've got there, Dunmore," Cal said. "That's Nomad, service number ending 4471. 3 deployments, Helmand and Kandahar both, explosive detection primary, cross-trained in tracking. His handler was a kid named Cortez, Miguel Cortez, 26 years old, killed in an ambush outside Sangin about 6 years back. Dog took shrapnel in the same engagement, lost partial vision in the left eye, and by every account I can find, refused to leave Cortez's body until the recovery team physically restrained him. That's the eye damage you're describing. That's the scarring too." Jake sat very still, looking across the small kitchen at Nomad, who had finally, cautiously, settled onto a folded blanket near the door, watching him with that clouded left eye. "What happened to him after that?" Jake asked. "Standard protocol, they tried to reassign him to a new handler," Cal said. "Didn't take. Dog wouldn't bond, wouldn't work reliably, started showing aggression during evaluations that had nothing to do with actual threat detection and everything to do with a nervous system that had been running on fumes for months. There was a recommendation on file to euthanize him. Happens more than anyone likes to admit. Dogs that come back that broken and can't be safely reassigned. Way I heard it, a combat medic attached to the same forward operating base fought that recommendation for 3 straight months, filed the paperwork himself, took him home on an unofficial adoption once he separated, and by all accounts never looked back." "Elias," Jake said quietly. "That be my guess," Cal said. "Sounds like the two of them found each other at exactly the moment they both needed saving. That happens more than people think too." Jake sat with that for a long time after he hung up, watching the dog sleep, really sleep. For the first time since Jake had brought him home, the tension finally easing from his scarred shoulders, and understood with a clarity that settled somewhere deep and permanent in his chest that he wasn't just caring for a grieving animal. He was carrying forward a promise Doc had made 6 years ago to a dog nobody else had been willing to save. The weeks that followed built slowly into something Jake hadn't realized he'd been missing until it started. Filling the empty spaces in his days, he fell into a routine without quite meaning to. Up before dawn, Nomad's nails clicking on the linoleum behind him as he made coffee, a walk down the gravel road that ran past the trailer while the fog was still burning off the fields, the dog's nose working constantly, cataloging a world Jake had stopped paying attention to years ago. He started talking to Nomad the way some men talk to themselves in an empty house, working through the small engine repairs in his shed with a running commentary the dog seemed, in his own quiet way, to appreciate, ears flicking toward Jake's voice even when he was dozing in the corner on an old moving blanket that had slowly become, without either of them officially deciding it, his bed. There was a particular sound Nomad made that Jake came to recognize within the first 2 weeks and grew, against every expectation he'd had for himself, genuinely fond of a low, huffing exhale through his nose, 3 short breaths in a row, that he produced almost exclusively when something in the world had met with his approval. He did it the first time Jake fried eggs and let a piece fall to the floor. He did it again, more softly, the evening Jake finally moved the folded blanket from the hallway into his own bedroom, without comment, and Nomad settled onto it with a long, contented groan that Jake would have sworn, if he hadn't known better, sounded almost like relief. "You've got opinions, don't you?" Jake said, the first time he caught the sound, glancing over at the dog with something that felt, for the first time in longer than he wanted to admit, uncomfortably close to a smile. "All right, noted. I'll take it under advisement." The nights were harder than the days, for both of them. Jake's own sleep had never fully recovered from 11 years of intermittent nightmares, sudden jolts awake with his heart hammering and his hand reaching instinctively for a rifle that wasn't there, and it took him nearly 3 weeks to notice the pattern, that on the nights he woke gasping, disoriented, Nomad was already awake beside him, pressed close against his side, a steady, warm weight that Jake gradually understood the dog had positioned there on purpose. The same way a good working dog positioned himself between his handler and any threat he could sense but not yet name. You don't have to do that, Jake told him, one particularly bad night in early August, his hand resting on the dog's scarred flank while his own pulse slowly settled. I've had worse nights than this. I can handle it. Nomad simply exhaled his 3 short breaths and didn't move, and Jake found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he didn't especially want him to. There was a harder night too, close to the end of the second week, when a summer storm rolled through Cummer Falls with a violence that shook the trailer's thin walls, thunder cracking close and sharp enough that Jake felt his whole body lock rigid before his conscious mind caught up to the fact that it wasn't incoming fire. He came back to himself sitting on the kitchen floor with his back against the cabinets, breathing hard, and found Nomad pressed flat against the floor beside the refrigerator, trembling violently, his one clear eye wide and unseeing, lost somewhere in a memory Jake would never fully know the shape of but understood, on some fundamental level, better than almost anyone alive. Hey, Jake said softly, crawling across the small kitchen to sit beside him, resisting every instinct to reach out too fast. Hey, I've got you. It's just weather, buddy, just weather. He sat with the dog through the worst of it, keeping his voice low and steady, the same running commentary Doc had once used on him in the back of a Humvee with the world on fire around them, and slowly, over the better part of an hour, felt the trembling ease, felt Nomad's breathing slow to match his own. Somewhere around the tail end of the storm, the dog shifted his weight until his head rested against Jake's thigh, and Jake sat there in the dark kitchen, one hand resting on the scarred fur of an animal who had lost his first handler in an ambush and grieved his second on national television, and understood with a certainty that surprised him that this exact moment, this exact quiet, was the closest thing to peace he'd felt in over a decade. We're gonna figure this out, he told the dog quietly. Both of us. I don't know how yet, but we will. He started keeping a small notebook after that, jotting down the things that seemed to help, the specific cadence of voice that eased Nomad through a panic response, the particular way of approaching him during a startle that never triggered the growl, the fact that he settled fastest with one paw resting against Jake's foot rather than any other point of contact. And it was only when he caught himself, 3 weeks in, reading back over the notes one evening, that he realized he was documenting his own recovery in the same careful shorthand, the same slow, deliberate progress, page after page of 2 broken creatures learning, together, how to be less broken. He took Nomad to see a vet in Radford in the 4th week, mostly out of an overdue sense of responsibility, and left the appointment with a wound care routine for a patch of old scar tissue along the dog's flank that had never fully healed right, tender and prone to irritation in humid weather. It became, over the following days, one of the quiet rituals that anchored them both, Jake cleaning the site each evening with slow, careful hands, keeping up a low stream of conversation the whole time, Nomad holding perfectly, trustingly still despite the discomfort. In a way the vet had told Jake, with some surprise, most working dogs with his history never fully managed with anyone outside their original handler. That's not medical, that's trust, the vet had said. He's telling you something, letting you do that without a fight. I'd pay attention to it. Jake did pay attention to it, more than he let on to anyone, including, for a long time, himself. He noticed the way Nomad's ears came up, alert but unafraid, the moment Jake's truck turned onto the gravel road each evening after a supply run into town. He noticed the way the dog had started sleeping through most nights without the old restless pacing, curled now against Jake's side rather than stationed anxiously by the door. He noticed, with a quiet ache he didn't examine too closely, that he had started looking forward to mornings again, something he hadn't expected to feel again after the divorce, after the endless disability review, after 11 years of simply enduring one day so he could endure the next. It was late in the 4th week, on an ordinary Tuesday evening with nothing particular marking it as different, that everything changed. Jake had been going through a box of Doc's old belongings that Marion had shipped up from Radford, mostly paperwork from Whitfield's watch that she hadn't known what to do with, along with a handful of personal effects she'd thought Jake, as Nomad's new guardian, ought to have. He was sorting through it at the kitchen table, mostly out of a slow, aching need to feel closer to his old friend, when Nomad, who had been dozing near the door, suddenly went rigid. It wasn't a bark. Jake had learned over 4 weeks that Nomad rarely barked at all, and when he did, it carried the same short, controlled cadence Jake had heard at the cemetery, deliberate, purposeful, nothing like ordinary agitation. This was different. The dog rose slowly to his feet, moved to the kitchen table with a stiff, focused gait Jake recognized instantly from years of handling working dogs himself, and sat, perfectly still, nose pointed directly at a manila folder near the bottom of the box, one paw raised slightly off the floor. It was, Jake realized with a slow, cold understanding, a trained indication, not a random interest. a specific, deliberate signal, the kind a scent detection dog gave when he'd located exactly what he'd been trained to find. "What is it, buddy?" Jake asked quietly, already reaching for the folder. Nomad didn't move, didn't relax the indication, his one clear eye fixed on the folder with an intensity that raised the hair on Jake's arms. Inside was a set of financial documents, bank statements, grant disbursement records, a series of increasingly terse emails between Elias Whitfield and a name Jake recognized instantly with a jolt of cold recognition. Gary Hollies, the man in the expensive suit at the cemetery gate, the man who'd stood in front of Nomad and called him a liability issue. The emails painted a picture that took shape slowly, then all at once, as Jake worked through them with the same methodical patience he'd once brought to clearing a room. Hollies had joined Whitfield's watch as a financial administrator 18 months earlier, brought in, according to an early email, specifically to help professionalize the nonprofit's grant reporting as the organization grew beyond what Doc could manage alone. Over the following year, the tone of Doc's emails shifted, subtly at first, then with increasing urgency, questions about discrepancies in the housing assistance disbursements, requests for documentation that never seemed to arrive, and finally, in an email dated just 9 weeks before Doc's death, a direct accusation. "I've been through the last 3/4 of disbursement records twice now," Doc had written, "and I count at minimum $40,000 in housing assistance funds that never reached a single veteran on our waiting list. I want a full accounting by Friday, Gary, or I'm bringing this to the board and to the state attorney general's office. I built this organization to help men and women who don't have anyone else in their corner. I will not let you turn it into something else." There was no response from Hollies in the folder. The email th. Read simply ended there, 9 weeks before a coroner in Radford County ruled Elias Whitfield's death an accidental overdose, mixing prescription medication his own doctor's records, also included in the folder, apparently gathered by Doc himself in the final weeks, showed he had never actually been prescribed. Jake sat back slowly in his chair, the folder open in front of him, and looked at Nomad, who had finally relaxed his indication and now sat watching Jake with the same steady, patient alertness he brought to everything. "You knew," Jake said quietly, "this whole time, you knew something was wrong." He thought back with a chill settling low in his stomach, to the cemetery gate, Hollies' face, his irritation, his insistence that the dog not be present, dressed up as policy and dignity and liability, when the truth, Jake now understood with cold clarity, was something much simpler and much darker. Hollies hadn't wanted Nomad anywhere near that funeral, because Nomad had spent 3 years living and working in the same office where Doc had apparently been quietly building a case against him, and a well-trained detection dog, brought close enough to Hollies on a day when his own nerves were already frayed, was a risk Hollies clearly hadn't been willing to take. Jake spent the next 4 days working the problem the only way he knew how: slow, methodical, and quiet, the way he'd once cleared a compound one room at a time rather than rushing in and losing the whole picture to chaos. He drove to Radford and spoke with Marion Castellan again, laying out what he'd found, and watched her face go through disbelief, then a kind of grim, grieving clarity that told him she'd half suspected something wrong for months without ever having the pieces to prove it. He'd been different these last few months, she admitted, sitting across from Jake in her small kitchen, Nomad settled watchfully at Jake's feet. Stressed, losing weight he couldn't afford to lose. I asked him about it twice, and both times he just said he was handling a complicated situation and didn't want to worry anyone until he had all the facts straight. That sounds exactly like something he'd say if he'd found what you're describing and wanted to be absolutely certain before he brought it to anyone. "Did Hollies have access to Doc's apartment?" Jake asked, "the one above the office?" "He had a key," Marion said slowly, understanding dawning in her expression. "For emergencies. Everyone on staff did. Jake, you don't think?" "I think," Jake said carefully, "that a man who was about to lose his job, possibly face criminal charges, and had access to that apartment, deserves a closer look than a rushed coroner's report gave him. I'm not saying I know what happened that night. I'm saying I think somebody owes it to Doc to actually find out." He called Cal Ridgway again that evening, not for information this time, but for a favor, and Cal, who had spent 30 years in a career built on exactly this kind of careful, unglamorous verification, connected him with a retired Army CID investigator, now working private cases out of Roanoke, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Denise Acaffer, who agreed to review the financial documents within the hour of Jake sending them over. She called back 2 days later, her voice carrying the particular flat seriousness of someone who'd found exactly what she was looking for and didn't like it one bit. "This isn't sloppy bookkeeping," she told Jake. This is a deliberate, layered embezzlement scheme going back at least 2 years, funneled through 3 shell vendor accounts Holly's set up under variations of his wife's maiden name. Your friend caught it. Based on these emails, he caught it months before he died, and he was building a case methodical enough to survive scrutiny before he took it public. That kind of caution costs time. Time is exactly what somebody with a lot to lose might have decided he didn't have. You think Holly's had something to do with his death, Jake said. It wasn't a question. I think the coroner's report deserves a second look, with this financial evidence attached to the request, Ackeffer said carefully. I can't promise you a murder charge, Mr. Dunmore. Toxicology this old, without an original autopsy flagging foul play, is a hard case to build after the fact. But I can promise you the embezzlement charge alone is airtight, and once that comes out publicly, it's going to raise exactly the kind of questions that might finally get your friend the real investigation he deserved from the start. Jake spent that night sitting on the trailer's small back step with Nomad beside him, the two of them watching the stars come out over the dark Virginia hills, and found himself talking to the dog the way he might once have talked to Doc himself, working through the shape of a plan he hadn't fully admitted to wanting until the words were already out of his mouth. We're gonna finish what he started, Jake said. Quietly, you and me, I don't know exactly how yet, but we owe him that much, both of us. Nomad exhaled his 3 short breaths, low and steady, and pressed his shoulder against Jake's leg, and Jake decided, for the second time in a month, to take that as a yes. The break came 4 days later, and it came from a source neither Jake nor Denise Ackeffer had fully anticipated. Marion Castellan, going through the last of the office's unsorted filing cabinets at Whitfield's watch under Ackeffer's guidance, found a small floor safe hidden beneath a loose panel in the back office closet, a safe Holly's had apparently either forgotten about or never known existed, installed years earlier by a previous administrator and left unused since. Inside, wrapped in a waterproof folder, was a second, more complete set of records. Bank transfer confirmations, a handwritten ledger in Doc's own careful print, and a single audio recording, 40 minutes long, that Doc had apparently made on a small digital recorder 3 weeks before his death, documenting a confrontation with Holly's in painstaking methodical detail. The same steady voice Jake remembered from a dust-choked Kandahar morning, laying out, calmly and without a trace of fear, exactly what he intended to do about what he'd found. I know what you've been doing, Gary, Doc's recorded voice said, weary but resolute. I've got the documentation. I've got the transfers. I'm giving you one chance to make this right before I take it to the board, and I want that on record, because whatever happens after tonight, I want it clear I gave you the chance to do the right thing first. Holly's response, recorded faintly in the background, was less measured, a mixture of denial than pleading. Then, in the final 2 minutes of the recording, something that made the hair on Jake's arms stand up when Ackeffer played it for him over the phone, a low, controlled threat, delivered in the flat voice of a man who had already decided what he was willing to do to protect himself. You don't understand what you're threatening to take away from me, Holly said. I've got nothing left if this comes out. You think about that before you go running to the board, Elias. Think real hard about what you're willing to risk over paperwork. That's not proof of murder, Ackeffer said carefully once the recording ended, but it's proof of motive, proof of a direct threat 3 weeks before his death, and combined with the embezzlement evidence, it's more than enough to reopen the case properly. I'm taking this to the county prosecutor's office myself, Mr. Dunmore, today. Gary Holly's was arrested 6 days later. Not for murder, Denise Ackeffer had been honest about how difficult that charge would be to prove after the fact, and in the end, the toxicology evidence remained too ambiguous to support it. But on 12 counts of embezzlement, wire fraud, and falsification of nonprofit financial records, a case so thoroughly documented by Doc's own careful, methodical evidence gathering that the state attorney general's office later called it one of the cleanest financial fraud prosecutions their office had handled in a decade. Jake was in the courtroom the day Holly's was arraigned, sitting quietly in the back row with Marion Castellan beside him, and he felt no particular satisfaction watching the man in the expensive suit, noticeably less expensive now, noticeably more haggard, enter a plea through his attorney. What he felt instead, watching Holly's avoid looking at anyone in the gallery, was something quieter and more complicated, the simple, grim relief of a debt finally, properly paid. The financial fraud case drew local news coverage, and within it, inevitably, the story of the funeral, of the dog who wouldn't leave the coffin, of the trained indication that had ultimately cracked the whole scheme wide open. Reporters wanted to talk to Jake. A local station wanted footage of Nomad. A veterans advocacy group offered Jake a modest cash award for what they called his role in exposing fraud against a nonprofit that served men and women like himself, and a national outlet reached out about a longer feature. Jake turned down most of it quietly, without much explanation beyond a simple "I appreciate it," but that's not really what this was about. He accepted exactly one interview, a short, careful conversation with a local paper, mostly because Marion asked him to, so that the community that had known and loved Elias Whitfield could finally understand what had actually happened to him, instead of the sanitized, incomplete version the coroner's office had first offered. People deserve to know Doc didn't just have a bad night, Jake told the reporter, Nomad lying quietly at his feet throughout the interview, exactly where he'd taken to positioning himself these past weeks whenever Jake sat still for long enough. He was murdered by neglect and greed, even if the law can't quite call it that outright. He spent his life after the army trying to take care of people nobody else would look after. This dog right here is proof of that. I'd like people to remember him for that, more than for how he died. The modest cash award from the Veterans Advocacy Group arrived 3 weeks later, and Jake used exactly none of it on himself. He put half toward finishing Whitfield's Watch's stalled housing assistance program, working with Marion and the organization's remaining board to ensure the veterans still on that waiting list finally got what Doc had always intended for them. The other half he used quietly, without telling anyone at first, to fence in a proper yard around the trailer, install a real dog door, and build, out behind the shed, a modest covered kennel with a soft bed and a water line that never froze, though Nomad, given the choice most nights, still ended up curled at the foot of Jake's own bed regardless. His disability review, delayed for 14 months by a bureaucracy that had seemed, for a long time, entirely indifferent to whether Jake Dunmore existed at all, was quietly approved 4 months later, expedited, an overworked caseworker later admitted, partly because of the local news coverage that had made Jake's name briefly, uncomfortably familiar to people well beyond Cummer Falls. Jake didn't much care about the reason. He cared that the backlog of unpaid bills finally cleared, that he could afford real groceries instead of whatever kept, that he could finally stop doing the particular quiet math of survival that had occupied a corner of his mind every single day for over a year. But none of that, in the end, was the thing that mattered most. What mattered most came on a quiet Sunday morning in October, nearly 5 months after Jake had first crouched beside a casket at Cedar Hollow Memorial Cemetery and told a grieving dog that he understood, when Jake drove the 2 hours back to Radford, Nomad riding in the passenger seat now instead of the truck bed, nose pressed contentedly against the window crack, and walked together with him to a modest granite headstone that read ELIAS, Doc, WHITFILD. Sergeant First Class, United States Army, beloved friend, tireless advocate, and beneath that, a line Marion had insisted on adding once the truth had finally come out. He finished what he started. Jake knelt in the cool autumn grass, one hand resting on the headstone, and Nomad settled beside him without needing to be told, laying his scarred head across Jake's knee with a long, quiet exhale that carried none of the frantic, grief-stricken energy of that first terrible day. This was something different, something settled, something that looked, to anyone passing by, almost like peace. "We did it, Doc," Jake said quietly, his hand moving slowly through the fur along Nomad's neck. "Took us a while, but we finished it." He sat there for a long time, the autumn sun warm on his shoulders, the dog's steady breathing the only sound besides the wind moving through the trees at the edge of the cemetery, and understood, with a clarity he hadn't expected to feel again after everything the last 11 years had taken from him, that he was, for the first time in longer than he could accurately measure, simply and quietly okay. Not fixed, not finished healing. But okay in the way that mattered, anchored again, to something worth waking up for. Nomad huffed his 3 short breaths against Jake's knee, low in content, and Jake found, kneeling there in the quiet grass beside his friend's grave, that he was smiling, and that the smile, for once, didn't feel like it cost him anything at all. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me putting it together, I'd be so grateful if you'd hit that like button and subscribe for more stories like it. It truly makes a difference in helping this channel keep telling them. Drop a comment and let me know what part stuck with you most, whether it was Nomad refusing to leave that casket or the quiet, steady bond he built with Jake afterward. And if you know someone who loves a story about loyalty, healing, and the bonds that carry us through our darkest moments, please share this one with them. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.